Hello everyone, welcome and thank you so much for coming to Students for Justice in Palestine's event. For those of you who don't know, Students for Justice in Palestine is a human rights event. We work to raise awareness about the conflict between Palestine and Israel and encourage activism on and off campus. This evening, we would like to introduce the esteemed Dr. Norman Finkelstein. He is a world-renowned political scientist, activist, professor, and author. Dr. Finkelstein's primary fields of research are the Palestine-Israel conflict and the politics of the Holocaust. Without further ado, Dr. Norman Finkelstein.
Well, thank you for having me. It is what I always do when I come to Florida or California, which is I made a beeline for your pool. It was a little cold. You can tell them to turn up the heat a little. It was also small. They had only 2 lanes. Why is that? People here don't swim? They don't know how to? Is that true?
Got to go to the ocean.
They go to the ocean?
Yeah, the beaches are the best.
Oh, okay. I'm not going to the ocean. Oh, thank you for having me. And what I want to do this evening is 2 things. First of all, I want to run through the actual record of what happened this past summer in Gaza, the 3rd Israeli massacre in 6 years in Gaza, and in between the massacres, the illegal, immoral, and inhuman siege of Gaza. I'll look back at the other massacres, the one in 2008-9, Operation Cast Lead, 2012 Operation Pillar Defense, and but mostly I'll focus on the latest of Israel's maniacal massacres in Operation Protective Edge. Once I do that, I want to do something which I think is of equal importance, which is to try to figure out how do you resolve this conflict, because it seems to go on interminably. People, I think, are losing interest in it rapidly, and the prospects for a reasonable settlement seem to me to be diminishing with time. And so I think we have to figure out how do you end this. And I will tell you my opinion based on having studied the topic now for 32 years, which is to say my entire adult life. What in my judgment, which is not the last word, it's just my judgment, what in my judgment can work and what I don't think can work in trying to end the conflict. So let's begin with what happened this past summer. As no doubt everybody in this room knows, between July 8th and August 26th, those 51 days, Israel went on a rampage in Gaza and inflicted massive death and destruction. When or how did it begin? The story really begins in April 2014, when the main Palestinian political factions, Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, or Fatah, the 2 main Palestinian factions, they agreed to a unity government, or a government as they called it, of national consensus. Surprisingly, the United States and the European Union, both of them did not suspend relations with the Palestinian Authority after this unity or consensus government was announced. Not only did the US and EU not suspend the negotiations with the Palestinian Authority, but Hamas indirectly agreed to the European Union and US conditions for negotiations. The conditions have historically been, number one, you have to recognize Israel, number two, you have to renounce violence, and number three, you have to honor past agreements. Well, the Palestinian Authority announced in the name of both Hamas and the Palestinian Authority, announced in both of their names, they announced or reiterated their acceptance of these terms for negotiations. And for Israel, this was a veritable disaster, because for anyone who understands the real record of the conflict, and not the fictitious one that Israel states and the media repeat, the actual record is, it is not Hamas so-called terrorism, it's not Hamas violence, it's not Hamas extremism that caused Israel to go into a panic. It's Hamas moderation. It's Hamas reasonableness. That's always been the case in the conflict, not just in the instance of Hamas, but the Palestinians generally. Right now, I'm going through the record on the negotiations that led up to the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt in 1979. The 2 volumes of what's called the Foreign Relations of the U.S. Documents were just released. They're quite voluminous. They run to probably 3,000 pages. And I'm currently, I think last night, I stopped at page 700, and I'm going through it 100 pages every night. I have to say, it's actually quite fascinating. You learn a lot. Even though I thought I knew a lot, I realized, no, there's still plenty to learn. I mention it because at one point, Israel is about, this is 1977, Israel is about to attack what was called back then the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, which was based in South Lebanon. And Israel was about to attack it. So the US officials, they're communicating amongst each other, why do you think Israel is going to attack? And one of them says, well, probably because the PLO, Yasser Arafat, they seem ready to accept UN Resolution 242. They were being too moderate. And so Israel had to attack in order to fortify the extremist elements in the PLO and get the PLO to reject UN Resolution 242, the resolution which has always been seen as the basis for resolving the conflict. As an Israeli commentator, political scientist, his name is Avner Yaniv, in a quite good book, it's called Dilemmas of Security. It was on Israel's invasion of Lebanon in June 1982. He said, what Israel dreads, and now I'm using his expression, not my own, he says what Israel dreads is the Palestinian peace offensives. The Palestinian peace offensives. Because then it has no excuse not to negotiate and end the conflict. So if we fast forward from 1977, where I was a few moments ago, and in 1982, where I was a half moment ago, and we come up to the present, Israel was facing another one of those dreadful prospects, the Palestinian peace offensive. There was a unity government about to be formed, and the unity government had accepted the terms for negotiations which the US and EU themselves had established. So Mr. Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister, he raged. How can you be negotiating with Hamas? Hamas is a terrorist organization. He raged and he lashed out, but there really wasn't much he could do. He was particularly enraged because this was the second time the US and EU were ignoring him. The first time was when the US, what was called the 5+1, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council plus Germany, when the 5+1 entered into negotiations with Iran on trying to find a diplomatic settlement to the conflict with Iran. Israel dreads the prospect of diplomatic settlements because, just as there are some people in this room, I'm told, who are veterans of the 1960s and remember the famous line of John Lennon, all we are saying is give peace a chance, and Israel's slogan is all we are saying is give war a chance, and another chance, and another chance. So he lashed out when the US and 5+1 entered into negotiations with Iran, and unfortunately, we're going to have to bear witness to a new chapter in that case of Israeli lunacy, when the maniac comes to speak before the US Congress on February 11th. But he couldn't do much until a gift dropped into his lap. And the gift was the abduction and then almost immediate killing of 3 Israeli teenagers in the West Bank. Now, Netanyahu knew almost immediately 2 things. He knew, number one, that this abduction and then killing was not authorized by Hamas's leadership. And number 2, he knew that the 3 kids, the 3 teenagers, were killed almost immediately. But here was an opportunity. Mr. Netanyahu is, if nothing else, he's a politician, and he knew here was an opportunity to exploit this opportunity, exploit what happened. And so he launched what was called Operation Brother's Keeper. The Israeli troops went on a rampage in the West Bank. They killed a half-dozen Palestinians, demolished several homes, ransacked businesses, and arrested approximately 700. I'm not sure if it's 500 or 700. My memory slips on that. Either 500 or 700 Palestinians, overwhelmingly members of Hamas. And the purpose was perfectly obvious for anybody who understands the real politics and not the fictitious politics of what goes on there. The purpose was to evoke some sort of terrorist response by Hamas, so that Netanyahu can then go before the world stage and say, you see, I told you, they're terrorists. Why are you negotiating with them? And in fact, he said just that a few weeks later. He said to a senior official in Washington, quote, never second guess me again on Hamas. When I say it's a terrorist organization, it's a terrorist organization. At the beginning, Hamas resisted the provocations of Israel, but other armed factions in Gaza hid back. The situation quickly spiraled out of control, and then on July 8th, Israel launched Operation Protective Edge. It did not yet launch, however, its ground invasion. The ground invasion didn't come until the 17th of July. Why? It's one of Israel's dilemmas. The dilemma is the following. Israeli domestic society does not tolerate large numbers of combatant deaths. In fact, it rather more tolerates civilian deaths than combatant deaths. It's sort of a Spartan-like society where the soldier is the most revered figure in society. And so Netanyahu understood his domestic support would begin to crumble if he launched the ground invasion and large numbers of Israeli soldiers died, got killed. On the other hand, the only way you can avoid large numbers of combatant casualties, there's only one way to do it. You go in and you blast everything in sight, which is exactly what Israel did in 2008-9 during Operation Cast Lead. It went in, and the orders were, it was, for anyone who cares to read what the Israelis themselves say, anything moves, you blow it up. Everything a mile to the left of you, a mile to the right of you, a mile ahead of you, you just flatten it. That's a very effective way to avoid combatant casualties. And so in the case of Operation Cast Lead, there were all of 10 combatant casualties, of which 4 of the 10 were due to friendly fire, Israelis accidentally killing others. So there were only 6 Israeli soldiers killed during Operation Cast Lead, that's 2008-9, due to resistance. However, after Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9, Israel got a lot of very bad PR. It got very serious, in particular with what was called back then the Goldstone Report, which was a very harsh, though in my opinion accurate, indictment of what Israel did in Gaza. The report concluded that Israel's purpose in Operation Cast Lead was to punish, humiliate, and terrorize the civilian population.